to be here today. I'll start by introducing myself, and then I'll move into a little bit, just a bit of a summary on the thesis that I did around innovative learning environments, and then I'll move on to the current government philosophy around ILEs and where I sort of see that moving forward. And then I'd like us to, I'm a big believer in let me put it this way. I'm not a big believer in the sort of sage at the stage teaching model. I think that many of our kids fall through the cracks when we adopt that model. So I want to hear from you, and we're going to have a little bit of interaction coming up soon. So also please start thinking of some questions that you may have for me, but also start thinking about some key messages that you want me to feed through the Minister of Education, Minister Chris Hipkins. So if you could start thinking about those as we go. So first of all, my story. So I was born down in Nelson. You know Nelson, the South Island? Oh yeah, a couple of us. Nice. So I was born in Nelson. Actually, my family came to New Zealand in 1850 from England on a boat called the Wakefield. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, he was 22 years of age, and he'd always been quite a sickly child. And I don't know if that was the standard procedure, but the parents decided, let's send him to the other side of the world. Must be, I guess, for the fresh air or something. So anyway, off he went, Robert James Strange. While he was on the boat, he met a young lady named Blanche Cook, and she was 16. They got married as soon as they landed in Nelson, and so began 170 years of my family here in this country. Fast forward to 1976, obviously I was born in Nelson. My dad was with the Public Trust Office. My mum was doing some admin work then. Mum was 19 when she had me, Dad was 20. And then when I was 7, we shifted to Wellington, and then to Prongya when I was, I think, 8 or 9. So I went through Prongya Primary School, went through Peachgrove Intermediate, and Hamilton Boys High School. After that, I always wanted to be a church minister. Where's our reverend? He's gone. But I always wanted to be a church minister, particularly with young people. So I went off to Bible college, as people call it, bridal college, which is where I met a young lady named Angela. Yes. sort of interesting story there. I was fairly young and probably impetuous, wanting to get on with things, and so we'd been together for 3 months as boyfriend and girlfriend. So I sat them with their parents and said, I'd like to marry your daughter. I think I was 18 at the time or something. And they said, we think you should wait for a while. So in my mind, a while was like 4 months. So I waited 4 months and then proposed, and she said yes, and then she phoned her parents, and there was silence on the phone. But things have worked out pretty well. I've been married for 23 years. After that, lived in Gisborne for a while, did an OE over in the UK, lived in Tauranga, and mainly working with young people, particularly teenagers. So I've got a particular passion around mental health for our young people. The suicide statistics really break my heart, and I guess that takes me through to at the age of 30 over in Tauranga. And I thought, what do I want to do, for the next sort of stage? I felt there was a change. So I decided to study music, actually. I've always been a musician, written about 40 songs. Still got an album on Spotify, funnily enough. So I came over here to Hamilton, basically came home to Hamilton. I studied at Wintec for 3 years. I studied music there. And then I did my 1 year postgrad in teaching here at Waikato University. And then fortunate enough to get the first job I applied for, which was at Barclay Middle School as a music teacher. I taught there for 6 years. While I was teaching there, during that period, I started my Masters in Educational Leadership through the Waikato University. Did 4 papers. I did 2 papers initially, and then I got the NZARE scholarship for the 1 year study. And during that time, I completed my thesis in innovative learning environments. And at that time, I was sort of also interested in politics, and particularly around education. without wanting to sound too political, but there were a few things under the previous regime I wasn't overly excited about, but and they did a lot of good things, so don't get me wrong, but there was an aspect around the NZARE of the curriculum that certainly concerned me, and I guess into sort of national standards, focus on literacy and numeracy, almost to the extent of others. I sort of felt there was a sort of danger there. And as a music teacher, back in 2012, there was some talk about removing specialist subjects from intermediates, and I guess for me, it wasn't just I'm going to lose my job. It was more just about I really saw the learning that took place, particularly say in the arts, for example, and even though I was teaching some skills, really what I found I was teaching was creativity, cooperation, confidence. All sort of key life skills there. So yeah, I got involved in politics and thought that it's important to have people from a range of areas in Parliament, and obviously education is something that we're all passionate about here today. Stood in 2014 in the Taupo electorate, which was the unwinnable seat for a Labour candidate. So obviously didn't win that, but it sort of showed the party that I was sort of reasonably reliable, at least. And then in 2017 I stood for Parliament again in the Hamilton East seat. If you go through, I guess maybe if it takes it's like July 2017, Labour was polling 21%, and I was I think 35 on the list. And I said to my wife, I said, "Oh look, I'm not going to get in. It's all good. I'll get in a couple of goes. You should take that full-time job at the so and so." And then Jacinda took over as leader, and within 7 weeks we went from 21% through to 40%. Which was very dramatic, and then obviously Winston Peters made a decision, and here I am. So there we go. And people say, "What do you mean? Like you went from youth worker, teacher, and now you're in Parliament?" And they're like, "How does that work? What does it mean?" But those three jobs are very similar. It's about people. It's about putting people first. It's about listening to people. It's about engaging. It's about helping people. My wife and I got 4 children, aged between 6 and 11. We had 4 and 5 actually, which is a bit of a blur. 2 boys, 2 girls, so we're certainly very blessed. My wife's a teacher, currently teaching at Hukanui Primary School. She's been teaching for about 10-15 years. She's actually standing for Waikato Regional Council, actually, so we'll find out on Saturday, tomorrow, actually, whether she has a job change. My mum's a teacher, been teaching for sort of 20 to 30 years down in Nelson. And my sister's a teacher, so yeah, education right to the family. And my dad works at the public trust and thinks teachers have too many holidays. So anyway, it comes up every Christmas. So I guess I might start by sort of segueing into my family. So when you look at our 4 children, 3 of them are sort of generally doing pretty well at school. The schooling system generally sort of works for them. They're currently at Hukanui School, which is sort of primarily single cell, but there is a little bit of ILE, particularly with some of the new builds there. However, our second son, Brooklyn, he's really struggling at school. And we actually had a conversation with him this morning because he said, the last few days he's been saying, "I don't want to go back to school." And so we've sort of started to really sort of tease that out. And the reality is that he's not engaged in schooling, and I guess that the key point for me is around student engagement, and how do we sort of improve our student engagement around, I feel like we cater for a certain group fairly well, but as we all know in education there are kids falling through the cracks. And sometimes that might be the home environment, and obviously with government have responsibility there, and I'll talk a little bit about that too. But sometimes it is how we deliver the curriculum. And so the conversations that you're having and the others are having around ILEs and ILEs that are currently in operation is really important around the student engagement. Because we said to Brooklyn, we said what is it that you don't like about school? And it sort of narrowed down to basically reading and writing. And he said, "I actually don't mind reading, but the writing I don't like." However, at home, he writes these really elaborate comic books. Really, really quite good stuff. Very creative. And so we sort of said, well, how does it work with your writing? And he said, well, you know, we just get told what we're going to write about. And so I said, well, you know, we just sort of teased it out, and I said, well, do they, you know, do they give you, but basically how does it work? And he said, well, I said, give us an example. And he said, well, for example, you know, we have to be a reporter. And I said, okay, that's cool. And I said, well, do you get to choose what you report about? You know, something that you're interested in, whether it's sports or something. He said, no, we get told what we have to report on. I said, what do you have to report on? He said, oh, it was our school visit to the zoo. And straight away the engagement's just gone. And so I started talking to him, and I said, well, if you could choose what you're going to report on, you know, what would you report on? He said, oh, probably the football match that Manchester City lost. You know, his team lost 2-0, and he was devastated. He had an emotional attachment to it and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, but and I mean, that sort of links to that. Yeah, the aspect around student engagement. And if I contrast that with Hobsonville Point School, which most of you know is a full ILE, and I remember speaking to a student up there, she was year 10, and she'd been through primary school ILE and high school ILE, so she'd only known ILE. She'd only known project-based learning and basically high level of student engagement. I remember saying to her, if you were told by a teacher, this is what we're going to learn. So for example, now we're going to learn about World War II, you know, or like now we're going to learn about this specific area. And I said, how would you feel if a teacher said that to you? Because I mean, that's how most of us in this room probably do. You know? And she looked at me as though I said the weirdest thing possible. She was like, what do you mean? I said, well, look, I didn't say it again. I said, if you had a teacher come in and teach said, students, we're going to learn about this for the following week or for this term. And she was like, well, that'd be awful. Absolutely awful. Yeah, it always sort of stuck with me, that aspect. However, to temper that, I think that some students do need that structure. And so it's about getting that balance. It's about getting the aspect of structure and also the aspect of students being able to take control of their own learning. Now, she seemed to be the type of girl who was quite confident taking control of her own learning. And some aren't. And so, you know, and so it's about understanding that. So it's about how do we get that right mix? And I often hear from parents who say, well, like my kid doesn't suit an ILE, you know, and they say extreme examples. They're sitting in the corner with an iPad, you know, for the whole day, and no one checks up on them, blah, blah, blah. Whereas other parents say, oh, my kid's thriving, you know, they're doing all this project-based stuff, and blah, blah, blah. And so some want their kids in a single cell, but very structured, and then others. So I think that's the tension point around there, around how we sort of do that. And then the other thing sort of linked to that thought is around the workforce. You know, so obviously, you know, one of our roles is to prepare students for a workforce. Obviously, we don't know what those jobs will be a lot of the time, and I know many of you have had those discussions, you know, preparing students for jobs that don't exist. And that's why I'm a big believer in. We call them the soft skills, but I think that demeans it, calling them soft skills. And, you know, in terms of, like I said before, you know, confidence, creativity, cooperation, you know, discipline, those sort of things. But one thing that concerns me is that if the curriculum is completely student-driven, student-led, then they move out of this education environment and they get to the workforce where it's often not employed, and they get told, okay, you're going to do this, this, and this at this time and that time, and the creative aspect is completely stifled, and like, you know, and I can see a lot of those people struggling, and I see a bit of a trend with millennials changing jobs sort of every year or 2 years or 3 years. When I talk to employers, they're like, man, we just can't keep people, you know, and it's the blame, you know, what's up with this new generation, you know, they won't hang around for 20 years. Yeah, so, you know, so that, you know, there's some interesting thinking that I've sort of been doing around that aspect there. You know, but I think that industry get the best out of their employees if if they do allow them to have that certain aspect of creativity and certainly the aspect of ownership as well. But it sort of concerns me a little bit if the education system is student driven, but then the workforce is not. I could see the students banging their heads and getting really frustrated. So, yeah, some people might have some thoughts around that as we move into a discussion point. In terms of the work that I did with my thesis, I might just read the conclusion, basically. So I interviewed 8 teachers who had worked with both single cell and ILE environments. So they'd moved from single cell into ILE. The 4 key themes that emerged from this research were student engagement, collaboration, pedagogical practice, and wider community engagement. And I'll summarise the findings. So the first one around student engagement. ILE is very much a student-led model where both teacher and student engage in learning together. It's about putting the student at the centre of the learning. Teachers model this by embracing lifelong learning. Responsibility is placed on the students to work independently and be involved in and responsible for their own learning. ILEs allow students the choice regarding where and how they learn. The students get to participate in decision making and co-create what and how they would like to learn, encouraging a high level of student engagement. The teachers interviewed enjoyed teaching in an environment with a high level of student engagement. ILEs tend to offer students and teachers a greater range of flexibility, openness and access to resources. Within an ILE there are a number of physical spaces available, such as breakout rooms that can be accessed depending on the student's individual learning style. And if I could just bring one point out of there, is that I'm a big believer in having those, I guess you call it breakout rooms. You probably widely call them flexible learning spaces. Like when you compare one open space and groups of kids sort of dotted around the room versus where you can just pull the door closed and have a small group in there just working. I think that is better. I know there's probably a little bit more expense around sort of having those sliding doors and those sort of things, but I think that is quite important because I know I guess a lot of us know sometimes students can get distracted if you're sort of hearing what's happening sort of right next to each other. But then basically what that's doing is then saying to the teachers, look, putting a high level of trust in the teachers, saying, here's your flexible environment. You as a group of teachers, you decide how you use those flexible areas. But as much flexibility as possible is something that I believe. Second one around collaboration. In an ILE context, strong positive collaboration must exist between teachers. Teachers and students, teachers and leaders, students, the school and the wider community. The Ministry of Education states that components of ILE include an environment where teaching and learning is collaborative, reflections and inquiries are shared and communities engage. This leads to a more robust, continuously improving community of practice. Collaboration between teachers is vital, as team teaching requires teachers to work very closely together. And I think that it's important that ILE doesn't, say you've got 3 teachers for 90 kids, it's important that it doesn't become, sage on the stage, one teacher with 90 and the other 2 are off, maybe like marking, like doing reports or marking or sitting in the corner and stuff. And I know that sounds cynical, but just to flag that it's important that we don't have that, because I was a bit concerned when I talked to some teachers and I'm like, how much of it is sort of students work in small groups and like breakout stuff, and how much of it is teacher at the front of the stage, and at times there was sort of quite a high amount of one teacher at the front, often just verbally sort of talking like this. So that's just something to keep an eye on. And I find that really interesting. I'll go back to myself in terms of sixth form maths. I love maths right through the fifth form. And in the fifth form, goes to you, another maths lover here. And in the fifth form, I did sixth form maths. I was always sort of a year ahead, blah, blah, blah. And I was quite good at it. And then sixth form, we had the teacher who would basically write on the board page 41 to 52. And then the teacher would give sort of like a little sort of 3-minute overview at the start and just sit down behind their desk. And that was it, and we just sort of like got on with it. And I went from being really good at maths to getting something like about 15% in my sixth form maths. And there were two things. One, there was no engagement, but two, I couldn't see the purpose of it, which I know is a wider discussion, but I couldn't see how what I was learning related to real life. Just a couple of little things there. But the other thing is that sometimes you'll have a teacher, sort of talk for 50 minutes. And I'm conscious that I'm doing that now, but someone will talk for 50 minutes or for a period, and then at the end of the teacher we're feeling great. It's just like, oh, that was good, I got all this learning done, and little did know the students stopped listening 59 or so, 49 minutes ago. And then, the aspect around collaboration is certainly really important, and like sometimes it can be a bit of a challenge, because you're working very, very closely together. I won't do too much here because I know most of you sort of know a lot of the stuff anyway. It's probably highlighting things that you've already researched. The pedagogical practice, professional development is a key component of working in an ILE environment, particularly for teachers moving from single cell to ILE. Where contrasted with single cell environments, ILEs offer students and teachers a greater range of flexibility and openness. Students are at the centre of their learning. They can have a greater say in constructing their learning pathways and outcomes. This then creates a high level of engagement, which sort of repeating what I said. In terms of wider community engagement, many parents are not familiar with the ILE environment, having been taught in a single cell environment while growing up. One of the key roles of the school leadership and teachers is to inform parents about the various aspects and pedagogy of an ILE environment. Schools do this in various ways, particularly running tours and educational sessions for parents and caregivers. Schools must be intentional about fostering this relationship. In order for a school to thrive, they require community support and buy-in. And in summary, according to my research, the key aspects of an ILE in New Zealand are student engagement, collaboration between the following stakeholders: students, teachers, school leaders and the wider community, the pedagogical practice involved in an ILE, and the wider school acceptance of this model of teaching. All four of these areas are linked and cannot be taken in isolation if an ILE school is to be successful in delivering an education system where students achieve to the best of their ability. The 8 teachers I interviewed predominantly enjoy teaching in an ILE environment. They particularly enjoy the aspects of collaboration and student engagement. They are passionate about making New Zealand's education system the best it can be and are proud to be playing their part. They are reflective practitioners constantly looking for ways to improve their teaching practice. The majority of these teachers indicated they would not like to go back to teaching in a single cell environment. They realised ILE is not without its challenges, but that the rewards, particularly around student engagement and students taking responsibility for their learning, far outweigh any potential difficulties. So that sort of highlights some of that. What's that, sorry? No, it was just one school, unfortunately. I can tell you, it was actually registered in junior high, and so it was about 2 years ago. And like they were struggling at times, because they were sort of in their infancy. And one of the challenges they had was around, how do you implement project-based learning if the students all want to do a completely different project? It really is, it's actually unsustainable. I mean, like 90 kids, 3 teachers, 90 different projects. So they were sort of narrowing it down to sort of 5 or 10. But basically I think that's fine to put those parameters there, but then within that, the students being able to identify within those parameters. It was, it would be interesting to go back and see how they're getting on. Just in terms of the messages from the government. So I spoke to Chris Hipkins, Minister of Education. In fact, it was pretty early on when I came into Parliament. I spoke to him about ILEs, and I asked him what his views were, and I'll sort of share some of them soon. And he asked for a copy of my thesis as well. So we've had a few conversations around it, and then obviously conversations with his staff, and conversations with the ministry as well. And I think that in the first 2 years of government, the minister's mind hasn't really been on ILEs, to be fair, because there's been a few, pressing issues, and some of them, which you will have heard of. One was obviously the Teachers Collective, working through that. The second one was around vocational education, and like we've got, we've got reforms underway there in vocational education, which most people know about. The national standards, which removed national standards, which was about broadening the curriculum. But an interesting link there is around teacher workload. I'm really concerned about teacher workload. I feel like, and I have spoken to some principals about this, we've removed national standards as a government, but I feel like a lot of schools do over-assess, and I think that's a real key area that we need to look at. And I mean, like some schools, it's different within every school, but if I could talk quite openly, this is just my personal view, is that I've been speaking to teachers comparing country schools versus city schools, and I'm seeing a little bit of a trend there, where in the country schools there does seem to be quite a high level of trust in the teachers. First of all, generally from the leadership, but also from the community. They tend to just let the teachers get on with doing it. They are generally not in a competitive environment. They're not competing with other schools. When you come to the cities, and I'm going to generalise here, and I'm probably looking more towards primary school because I haven't had as much to do with secondary school, but certainly in that primary school area, I see quite a bit of competition between schools, and I'm not sure it's always the best thing. I'm seeing a lot of teachers who are doing a lot of assessment, like, for example, running records being done sort of every 4 weeks. And for me, that's like, oh my gosh, like, you haven't even had a chance to teach within that 4 weeks to actually move the kid and then retesting them again. I do feel like, in a general sense, I feel like we do over-test. And I know that your government, linked in with the ministry, are doing some work around looking at the workload that teachers have. Sometimes teachers themselves, have to also have a look at themselves and say, well, how much work am I doing? But then other times that is prescribed upon them. And so the aspect around workload, I think is a really important discussion moving forward. I'll just sort of park that. I'll just sort of put that out there. But I mean, like for example, I was speaking to a teacher, who's one of the city schools here in Hamilton in terms of a primary school. And I said, when you move from she'd been in a country school. When you move from a country school to a primary school, how much more workload do you have? She said it tripled. The workload tripled coming to a city school. And that was the primary school context, but it was just sort of, sort of an interesting thing there. I mean, I lean more towards having a high trust model of the teachers, rather than starting with a low trust and putting all these regulations on there. However, that needs to be tempered because I know you have a high trust model, and teachers can be going after whatever they want, and that's obviously we've got to be aware of the extremes. And I just feel we probably moved a little bit too far into that. Anyway, that's probably obvious. But in terms of the government point of view, education. I sort of alluded to this at the start. Education is linked to other issues, family issues, housing, health, wages, the cost of living, and one particular one that concerns me is around housing. And like we're talking about students learning in a classroom environment, it's very difficult for them to learn if you haven't got some of those other key aspects stable. In Hamilton, we're 4,000 houses short, and I know I see some of the principals in the room, and like you would see this a lot. Students moving from school to school, and those families are basically homeless. Because they can't afford rent, and so they're bunking in with other family members, and then they're basically moving. So we're working really hard because we absolutely need to fix that as quick as we can. The aspect around housing, obviously has to be around health and other things. But in terms of specifically around innovative learning environments, there hasn't really, in terms of a high level, there hasn't been a change to what the previous government have done. So the previous government launched modern learning environments. Was that 2011, 2010? I think changed it. It changed the name to innovative learning environments, and we're basically carrying on that sort of same thing. But they basically at a high level, as a government, we don't believe we've got all the answers. And I'm sure that the ministry have that same philosophy that, we're here to learn as well. And to constantly, we appreciate that education is constantly evolving. And so having researchers like yourself and others who are in the industry right at the coalface, so it's really important to keep that engagement going with us. And the key point is that every school does have the aspect of autonomy. So schools literally get to choose, whether or not you're a single cell-based school or an ILE. From a government point of view, we certainly recognise some of the merits within ILE, but we also acknowledge that that's environment that we are cultivating here, and we do it. We can look overseas, but we've got our own version here that we're constantly working on. So I guess the key message is that we're encouraging ILE, but we're not forcing ILE on anyone. So that's sort of the key high level sort of message there. I might just read a little bit here, in terms of just to sort of reinforce that. The ministry values school leaders and boards of trustees' involvement in the design process, as it ensures that the physical components of the learning environment meets the needs of their students and communities and aligns with their approach to teaching and learning. At a minimum, the ministry's expectation is that the internal classroom environment has good acoustics, thermal comfort, ventilation and lighting, and the internal walls are not load-bearing to ensure future adaptability. We encourage adaptability as a feature of all spaces we build or upgrade, so they can easily be reconfigured as educational needs change over time. And that sort of alludes to what I was saying before, about having that flexibility of spaces. And then putting that trust on the teacher, saying you're the professionals, you're trained in this area, we put that trust on you to use those spaces, to utilise them in the best way that you can. Many schools are choosing to teach in more student-focused and flexible ways to reflect what the evidence says about effective teaching. Flexible spaces that are increasingly being included in school designs around the country are to support those kinds of teaching. It is the ministry's view that all schools should provide a learning environment that best supports educational success and well-being, and one that students, parents, whānau and communities can take pride in. Additionally, we recognise that our education system needs to prepare young people for a world we can't yet imagine. They will need to be confident, connected, actively involved, lifelong learners with competency in thinking, using language, symbols and text, managing self, relating to others, participating and contributing. And there's our 6 key competencies. The government has set the target that all schools will be providing quality learning environments with respect to property by 2030. To support this target, the ministry has developed a model to measure quality based on asset condition, fitness for purpose and operational efficiency. You might have seen around 2 months ago, Minister Hipkins announced 1.2 billion for our property. And basically the plan there is to take a long-term view of school property, rather than sort of have this sort of often convoluted bidding process that sort of takes place. Trying to just, working on just having a bit more certainty and a bit more clarity and a bit more information to the schools. This is a growth area, and there are a lot of schools under growth pressure.
Jamie, can I just ask, I just heard you say quality, and that's what my research has been about. So are you saying that quality is based on property, and quality in education is based on the building?
On that's specific to property. So I mean, property is part of it, but certainly not all of it.
Because I can hear there's someone else going.
That's just part of it. Obviously, like when you look at quality, you're looking at teaching. looking at community engagement, looking at leadership within the school. But yeah, no, just that aspect. Yeah, and quality within a physical space, just like I said, the core aspects, which we all aspire to. Which I mean, and to be honest, we do fairly well in New Zealand, but there's always room for improvement. But yeah, so that makes sense. Look, I can talk more, but I think I might leave it there because what I do want to do. What's that time? 11:37.
You've got time for questions.
Yeah. So I would like to. I'll go answer some of the questions, but also what I want to do. So we've got 3 till 12. Is that right? Or 10 till 12? So we've got 20 minutes. What I wouldn't mind doing is breaking that into 2 components. So one will be to have some questions from you, but secondly, I want to take some key messages from you back to Minister Hipkins, and so I'd like to have a small maybe table discussion, and then I'll write down. Why don't we start with any burning questions first? See what. Yeah.